There's some predictable things about conventions, but I'm wondering if you might be able to put your finger on a couple things that are a little less predictable about this convention.
Well, I'll say, Mark, there's a couple things that stand out about this convention that have nothing to do with the proceedings themselves. Okay, one does, one doesn't. Let's start with the obvious, the one that doesn't. How many tens of thousands of people are going to be showing up outside that convention hall, and what kind of noise are they going to make that's going to reverberate, particularly and importantly, as you know, Mark, on the national media and the international media? That is really going to be the backstory of this next 4 days. You know, they say that is the organizers that they took a step back when Biden stepped aside and Kamala, took the reins and said, well, should we tone things down for Chicago? They said that conversation lasted about 30 minutes, and they said, no way. Full speed ahead. We don't believe that as of yet, she has demonstrated substantial departure from the Biden approach to the Israel-Gaza conflict in particular. So away we go. And there's going to be other protesters there as well. I expect we'll see some folks who don't think there's enough being done on climate change and a host of other things. But the big issue, Mark, especially in light of the fact that two huge things are sitting out there in the Middle East. One is, are we going to actually see an agreement, a ceasefire agreement this week? There's been a lot of things out of the White House saying maybe. But over the weekend, some of those hopes were dimmed. And secondly, is the potential for an Iranian attack on Israel. And, that's still sitting out there. So there is so much backstory outside the convention hall. That's number one. The second one, Mark, is the uncommitted delegates. There are about 30 of them, for example, from Michigan and so forth. Are these uncommitted delegates going to use tomorrow, and they're basically calling it kind of a celebratory or commemorative roll call vote, because, of course, the official roll call vote was done online for Kamala Harris, and that's done. That's in the can. But during that process, are there going to be protests? Are there going to be speechifying about this kind of an issue? Yet to be seen.
Let me go back to your first point, and then we can get to the second. But the first point is, I have 2 points about the first point. My first is a question, because it's interesting. The Republicans, there must have been protesters there at their convention. I mean, it's not as though everything they do is without controversy. And yet, I didn't hear a lot about it or see a lot about it.
Well, the difference, Mark, is significant, and it is the following. There were, of course, there's protesters. There's protesters at the state capitol in Sacramento and in D.C. literally every single day, okay? But the difference is this, because the Israel-Gaza protesters represent a continued significant division within Kamala Harris's own party. That is the challenge. The progressive wing that has truly felt that the Biden-Harris administration has not taken this seriously enough. That is the number of deaths, the tens of thousands of Palestinians, the leaning on Israel more heavily, the restrictions on perhaps weaponry to them. There's a significant chunk of the Democratic progressive wing who are not happy still with the approach. And that is the danger, politically speaking, for the Harris-Walz ticket this week.
And the second question I had was, to what extent do you think that will influence dialogue in the hall? You've just said that they've kind of decided that they're not going to change to accommodate, in effect. I'm wondering to what extent you think, and this is not anything you can know, I'm just asking sort of you've been to so many of these and know much of this stuff. How much of that stuff from outside will spill into inside? And then once it does, how do you handle it in the hall? Like, what would be the appropriate way to handle it, and what would be the wrong way to handle it?
Right. Well, remember that, it's two things. One, outside the hall, Mark, this is going to be seen as, okay, demonstrations, protests. The organizers are saying they can have as many as 20,000 there today. That's not an insignificant protest. The question will become a couple things. Are the protesters successful in disrupting the convention anyway? How could they do that? Blocking off streets, all the usual. That would disrupt the flow of delegates, for example, in or out of the hall. Or, sadly, potentially violence. Now, certainly nobody hopes that happens. I think the organizers themselves have said this is going to be nonviolent, peaceful. But stuff happens in demonstrations, and sometimes there's people that are incite things. So let's hope that doesn't occur, but that's the stuff outside the hall. Inside the hall, Mark, keep in mind that at a number of the Kamala Harris events over the last weeks, there have been protesters inside her events, unfurling banners, yelling. Remember, she had that famous interchange early on in her process over the last couple of weeks where she said, look, I'm speaking now, and that was not seen as favorable by certain members of her party. So inside the hall, yes, there could be things. And apparently security is prepared for these inside and out. We'll see.
Now, on to the other side. While this is going on, there is something, I'll just mention it because we are talking about the other side, but I'll mention it in relation to the DNC because we're touching on that right now. There's something called bracketing that they do. So bracketing is when you do stuff that is a media event, that's the way it's intended to be, and it's usually done at the same time or in the same place or in some way relevant to the convention that's going on. You try to kind of counter-program. It's called political bracketing. So I think J.D. Vance's of the world may be involved in something like that. I don't know if Trump is. It's always a sort of, it's a roll of the dice as to how effective it is, but we can't expect that, right?
Yeah, and it used to be in the good old days, Mark, the good old days of politics, and by that people mean more traditional. The other party went dark during your convention week. I mean, there literally was not a peep out of the other side. That was seen as sort of a sign of mutual respect. And back in the day, it was also thought, and you could understand some of this pre-social media, it was thought, hey, you know what? The networks all have their people and cameras at the event site. They're not going to cover us, right? We could be standing out in a field somewhere and they'll be like, oh, thanks for coming. But now, of course, cameras are ubiquitous. They're on millions and millions of phones. So, counter-programming has become a thing, as we say. In fact, Trump's holding a rally in Pennsylvania today. And I would expect that throughout this week, and the Democrats did the same thing during the Republican convention, I would expect, yes, you would definitely see counter-programming. How much of it's going to be event-based? How much of it's going to be sending surrogates near the DNC or actually putting them in proximity where they can, speak their own minds? How much of it's going to be social media, press release type things? Yet to be seen. But I would certainly expect in our day there will be a constant stream of counter-programming.
Sure. When you say mutual respect, it just seems like such a quaint idea from so long ago.
They're all horrible. These are horrible human beings.
Yeah, right. So the nature of the discourse has definitely changed. All right. And then to the course ahead. I mean, after this convention, there'll be some pluses and minuses, I would think. Biden is speaking tonight. I was making the point that he's speaking kind of, first of all, early in the convention cycle of these several days, and also kind of late at night. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess it's prime time, but there's going to be some daylight between Biden and Kamala Harris, it would seem, and managing that daylight is something that this party has to do, right?
Yeah. To me, Mark, the most interesting insider game this week is just that. How do you honor a sitting president who, by all accounts, and all the details are still coming out about how much Nancy Pelosi was involved, how much she said. In fact, there was some interesting reporting yesterday, Mark, that one of the reasons that Pelosi was particularly miffed and wanted Biden out was because this perception that he favored the U.S. Senate over the House. And there's a number of House members who've now gone on record in the last 24, 48 hours saying, yeah, we saw that all the time. We felt like we were sacrificial lambs, that is the Democratic caucus in the House. And that because of Biden's longstanding relationships and affiliation with the U.S. Senate, they got the short end of the stick. So it's going to be really interesting to see how Biden is handled. Certainly, I said this from the very get-go. The minute he announced he was stepping aside, I said, well, Monday night at the convention is his. I said this weeks ago. This will be Joe Biden night. And it will be all about heaping praises on Joe Biden. Joe Biden is expected to speak. Hillary Clinton is going to speak. I mean, there's going to be a lot of accolades for the sitting president. And then And then it'll be, Joe, thanks for coming. We appreciate it. Because I will
We have a couple
guarantee
of
you,
vouchers at Applebee's, and you feel free.
yeah,
It's yeah, okay.
we got some free Happy Meals. We got all kind. We got a goodie bag for you and Jill, and we appreciate you coming. I seriously, I would expect to not see very much of Joe Biden in the next 3 days, and that's intentional, of course. I mean, Harris has to distinguish herself from a sitting president whose approval ratings continue to be very low, whose polling numbers, as you know, Mark, just 30 days ago were abysmal. She has to do that. I mean, she knows that. The Biden people begrudgingly know that and expect that to happen.
I mean, I think Dillette's saying Joe will be a mess late at night. Yikes! No, I mean it's a speech that's important. He'll be together, I would think. I mean, he's not going to come on, and I think he's not going to come on and be a mess. So I wouldn't. And the idea is, this is also a point being made, they better treat Biden with utmost respect, which he deserves, says Rain. And that's what you're saying, that they'll give everybody their respect, and then they want them to catch the first plane out. To sort of give the new wing of the party, if you will, let them turn the page and sort of suggest that there's a new wing of the party. It is interesting, too, I was making this point a little bit ago, that she both can benefit from and then pay a price for her association with Biden, can Kamala Harris, right?
Absolutely. I mean, this is the biggest challenge right now. And the last one of these tickets that we saw this challenge happen extensively, I think, Mark, you and I maybe touched on this last week, was Bill Clinton and Al Gore. When Bill Clinton was done and Al Gore was running, Gore's people faced this same dilemma. How much of course, they were looking at then a president, who had a lot of albatrosses around his neck, Monica Lewinsky and impeachment and other kinds of stuff that Joe Biden doesn't have. But it's the same dilemma. How much do we embrace? I was his VP. So how much do I embrace the sitting current president? How much do I say, listen, you know what? I'm a different kind of animal. I am going to do some things differently. I appreciated that. We got some things done. But here, I'm setting out a new course for my administration should I win. And that's what Kamala's been trying to do in the last week. Most notably with her economic speech on Friday, she tried to start charting a new and different course because some of the Biden, era policies are not all that favorable to people. And they still have bad feelings about inflation, the economy, immigration. And so she's going to have to do that. She's going to be forced to do that in the next 80 days.
And on the positive side, I mean, this is a guy who did get transformative legislation through a troubled political scene. Biden.
Yeah, well, right. And she will embrace some of those things. She will talk about the number of jobs they created. She will talk about the fact that inflation has reduced significantly, to the point where it is now, compared to 2 years ago. She'll talk about how they successfully navigated the end of COVID. I mean, there'll be a lot of those things. We're on the verge potentially of a Mideast agreement, although that is so volatile, I would expect that they'll stay away from that this week, unless they are pleasantly surprised with an agreement signed in the next 4 days.
That would be extraordinary.
Yeah, it would be. And that would be a huge get. That would be, and I have no doubt that behind the scenes, the Biden-Harris people have said that would be awesome if we could pull that off. But it's looking right now today like that may be tough slogging.
Yeah, betting against a peace agreement is always a good bet in the Middle East, sadly. But as mentioned, I like that Peter mentioned this in the chat. He said he greeted, and he's talking about Biden, greeted the Russian hostages home. He's talking about Biden's general sort of alertness and energy. But more to the point, it was a talking point for Trump and the GOP that, when I get into office, Donald Trump, I'll get those Russian hostages freed. So that was a win for this administration to get that done during their administration. And, right? I mean, that was, I put that in that same category of positives as a peace agreement might be.
Yeah, and you could also, there's a lot of things that they could say, right? They could say, well, look at the Ukrainian pushback on the Russians in the last 2 weeks. Well, that's because Biden led, the Harris-Biden team would say, that's because Biden led the international coalition, most notably our NATO partners, to get behind Ukraine, provide the armaments, push back against Putin. And now we have this counterinsurgency going on that, by all accounts, people saying is really rattling Putin, is changing some of the dynamics of that conflict. And now we have all of a sudden in the last couple of days, Mark, Zelensky saying, listen, time for us to have 200-mile range, cruise missiles to strap onto those F-16s you guys are going to be dropping on us soon. So there's a lot of things that could be said about these things. And it's going to be really interesting to see how much the Harris Walz team take the Biden-Harris playbook, slip a couple pages out of there and put them in their own, and how much they just say, yeah, you know what, we did some good things then, but it's a brand new playbook.
It's interesting, too, that there has been a kind of economic prosperity that's existed, but it hasn't trickled down to many of us in American life, and yet we've been ahead of the developed world in coming out of COVID. This is all under the Biden administration, right? I mean, Biden had to navigate this, and some of his economics team is going to make it over to the Harris team. It's a weird thing because you do have to, as you suggest, rip out pages. You have to pick and choose, and in so doing, you can get the brags, but how do you get it without, some of the stink of of an unpopular president, and Biden clearly was that.
Yeah, and the challenge really in the next 3 months is going to be felt realities of average voters versus the economic data. This is what every White House struggles with, okay? Look at the numbers, they'll say. Look at the numbers, look at the numbers. Biden tried to make that argument in May and in June, and it did not land, as you know, Mark, because people's felt perceptions are, and you can understand this, because we have to remember, though the fact that, on an annualized basis, we're now down in the 2-3% range for inflation, when it was up at 6, 7, 8%, bread still hasn't decreased in price, right? It's still high priced in the store, though the inflation averages have dropped significantly. And it's that felt reality that kept hitting Biden over the head with the 2x4 when voters were saying, yeah, but, okay. And that's the challenge that Harris still faces.
Yeah, I was talking about that before. The economy is also complicated, and politics and messaging is not complicated, meaning complex messages don't get through. So you've got to keep your messaging simple. So I kind of liked, and this is I'm beta testing this with you. I kind of liked that she mentioned price gouging, and even though we know there are price gouging laws for emergency situations, et cetera, but I think in general the public hears price gouging and they go, yeah, I'm paying too much for whatever. In other words, they don't distinguish price gouging from collusive price fixing, this kind of thing. So messaging on the economy is both complicated and yet you have to keep it simple.
Yeah, what's interesting about that price gouging, price fixing, price whatever, is that, in the most bare knuckle terms, it's an attempt to shift or at least move the responsibility for those high prices elsewhere, right? I mean, in politics, you don't want to just be the guy or gal that says, yeah, blame me, it's all my fault, heck. But let's do another 4 years and try again. That doesn't work very well. So corporations, as you well know, particularly from the Democratic Party point of view, have often been, a good place to assign blame. Same thing when it comes to taxes. They're getting the tax benefits. It's the rich corporations. And so that message has resonated. And, people are angry. I mean, you can't get around the visceral realities that voters are still upset that when they walk into the store, things in some cases are 50% more than they were 3 or 4 years ago. And of course, that was the argument that, that Reagan made back in 1980 that Trump has been trying to make, which is that classic line. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? When you walk into the store and walk out with your kids, do you feel better or worse than you did 4 years ago? That's what the Trump team is trying to get traction on. I think they're having some success with that, more limited than I think they maybe expected or had hoped. And so the Harris Walz team are doing everything they can to say, look, it's not our fault, at least exclusively. Look at this price gouging. Look at the taking advantage of things in the supply chain where everybody's been tacking on percentage increases that aren't warranted.
And I'm guessing you'll agree with me that making corporations, the bad guys that you yell at and talk about, we're going to take care of these greedy corporations that have led to a lot of these conditions, that's not a bad political move, and there might be some truth to it.
Well, I mean, unless you're part of the corporate world, right? Corporations, they are a fairly easy target, right? They're this amorphous entity that somehow has gotten, in some people's mind, undue First Amendment protections by the Supreme Court, campaign contribution protections. They're like, wait a minute, are they individuals or not? Or are they giant megaliths that hide behind a Wizard of Oz curtains? I mean, most people don't have much affection for the word corporation by its very, sort of ambiance. It's like, nah, those can't be the good guys.
That's exactly right. And I think that the idea somehow that Kamala Harris and her people are shaking their fists at corporations and suggesting that they might be behind some of this. They talk about price gouging. I don't know what sticks, but it seems to me that those might be pretty good boogeymen to go after in sort of this, your messaging about the economy anyway. Listen, I've kept you over time. Thank you. I know this is a big week for you. And if there's any breaking news, we may put the bat beam up and ask you to come back in. But so appreciate you and look forward to next week as well, Gary. Thanks so much. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped. And please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.